Hello and welcome to episode 5, our final episode in how to write bot applications using the bot framework. In the previous episode, we were looking at integrating Lewis with the bot. So if we just bring that back up now. So what we'll try and do in this episode is have a decent conversation. So we'll get back to where we were. So we were recognizing results from Lewis, and then we were looking at the top intent, and then we were sending just any kind of message back. Now what we could do here is put a big switch statement in here, and then if we were talking about one particular intent, we would just reply with that. And in this example, that would probably be okay, but moving forward, we want to do something a little bit more interesting. So as we looked at before, because there's not a lot of help with version 4, we'll move over to the samples. And again, I'm opening that in its folder version rather than the solution. But I'll quickly go into the solution. So we're using the bot basic, if you remember. So we'll just move down here again, open the solution. Wait for that. It's going to go slow. And come on. Right, so bot basic, what is this doing? So if you remember, we briefly looked at something called a dialog context, and that's going to be the key of what we're going to do next. So what they do in this example is they're doing something similar. They recognize result, they get the intent, they check to see whether there's some kind of quit message, which we can do as well. And then they do have a similar concept here with the switch statement, where they're going to be looking at the top intent and deciding whether to do a greeting or not. So basically they've got one dialog. So this dialog here, that's sort of what we'll be basing our example on too. So let's immediately go and have a look at this. So what's happening here is that the message will come into the bot, and then ultimately it will be starting this dialog. And dialog in this sense isn't like a dialog that you may see in other types of window UIs. This is a conversational dialog, and it derives from something called component dialog, and that's kind of what we'll be doing. So we're going to be basing pretty much everything on this. The example I want to do with this sort of politician bot is to have a very simple kind of conversation. So what I shall do is we will take this dialog pretty much as is, I think. So let's go into our project. Let's create a new folder called Dialogs. Let's keep some tidy mechanism. So I don't want to call it folder. I know it's called folder. Dialog. And we're going to create our new dialog in here. So add a new class. And I think I'll call it nice questions. And we saw that, well, I'm not going to guess, let's go and grab it. So it's from component dialogs, so this is how you derive it from there. So component dialog. Again, we'll ask it to fill in the problem, so it's going to be using dialogs, that's fine. Now this is going to then say, well, you need to implement something here. So again, generate the override, or actually generate the constructor that we need. So this is one of the first things you need to know about dialogs. is they want to have an ID. So when the framework starts, it needs to know the ID of all the dialogues that are running, and the way it does that is it will have this dialog ID in here, and this dialog ID needs to be unique for the caller. So in our case, our root may bot, any dialog that it can start, it must have a unique ID. We'll just leave it at that. You'll see in the samples that this can be sometimes hard-coded. In fact, let's have a look at how they're doing it in here. So we come down here and you see that they're just hard-coding this, the name of dialog. That's fine if you only ever going to use one instance of this dialog in here. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I actually think this is a little bit confusing if you're trying to learn it. So I'm going to stick with what we've got already, the dialog ID. So there's some additional parts to this. So let's just start with, in fact, I'll just copy these all over as well. So let's grab these, copy them into here. And again, we'll rely on Visual Studio helping us out here. So the one thing it won't be able to help out with is this thing called a greeting state. So this is something that's quite different to V3. By default, you don't get any state with the dialogues. You kind of do, but you have to do a little bit of extra work if you want to do that. What they try and make you do with V4 is to have this concept of passing in a separate state object. And in this case, they're calling it greeting state. So what we would do is we would create a class in here and call that nice questions state. And it just has to be a simple class. In fact, we'll prove that again. I don't want to make any assumptions. So we'll come in here, have a look at greeting state. You can see this is just a plain old class, nothing interesting there, just a state that we're going to hold. I don't know what state we're going to hold yet, but let's have a look. So nice question state, just leave it as empty, that's fine, doesn't have to have anything. And we'll put that in here. So nice question state. And question state, that's it. So because it's in the same folder, it will have the same namespace, so we'll already know about that. It's in something called a nice state property accessor, and this is a pattern that essentially all it really means is there's going to be an indirection to whatever it is, wherever we're storing this state, this thing is going to allow us to get at it. It's a widely known pattern, and it's just happened to be implemented here in this form, a state property accessor. We'll have to deal with that in a second, exactly how it works, but it's pretty easy to use. The last one here is logger, and that's using the dependency injection. It's passing in this logger so that we can log diagnostics out, and that's quite a standard pattern, and one that should be probably recommended that you use. So back to our sample dialog. So there's a lot of stuff here that's kind of noise. So we're just going to move over that. So let's have a look at how this is using the state accessor. So it's grabbing hold of this immediately. I just want to have a quick look at what this is. Yeah, this is actually a property on the dialog. So we'll do the same thing, because it's probably going to be useful to do that. This is a kind of standard pattern that you probably end up implementing all the time. So we'll come back in here, we'll do a similar thing. So user profile, user state. So user profile access, so that's fine. We'll just keep it that called that. Hopefully now this is working better. Yes, it is. Generate property. Fine, we'll allow that. So this dialogue, remember that when a message comes in, these dialogues are created brand new from every message that comes in. So this constructor will be called, and all these methods in here will be invoked every time a message comes in. So it's something to bear in mind. So now we've got our questions coming in. That's fine. So let's have a look what else they get us to do. So here's the first time we come across something called the waterfall step pattern, the waterfall step dialogues, and we will do something similar here. What we'll do is I'll just take these first two and explain what's going on. So we come into here, add this. Okay. So I quite like these steps, the initialize step thing, but try and get ahead of myself a little bit here. So what a waterfall step is if you imagine a conversation, and the conversation we're going to have with our politician is we're going to we've asked them a question. We're now going to say, depending on whether it's a nice question or an aggressive question. If it's a nice question, then we're going to want to respond initially with some kind of message back to the user, and then we're going to expect to get some kind of conversational piece back. So let's say we say a nice question is, did you enjoy your time opening the new or launching the new ship? And we're going to have the politician respond saying, yes, it was a lovely time. The weather was great, something like that. And then the politician will then say, have you got another question for me? Or they may start talking about, did you enjoy the weather? And then we expect the journalist to then ask another question. But that question may be, again, another nice question, or it may be another aggressive question. So our conversation is going to be quite short. So doing an initialize step is just to get this conversation to a point where all the details are set and we're kind of ready. The next one is going to be, we're going to say, respond to a positive question. And then we're going to prompt for the next question. And then that will be it, really. So that'll be quite a small conversation. You notice there's a naming convention here. So initialize states step async. So we want to follow that pattern as much as we can. So we'll call this one async 2, and then question step async. So these are all just simple steps. And to get this to work properly, we need to invoke the waterfall. So if you imagine this as a sequence of steps to a waterfall, you're falling off a waterfall, you're going to hit one step, then you're going to hit next step, and then you're going to hit next step as you go down. There isn't a concept of going down a step of waterfalls and then moving back up a waterfall. So there isn't that step. A waterfall is just always going to go down. The best you can do is get somewhere down the waterfall and then come off the waterfall and then go all the way back to the top again and then start your flow all the way down. There isn't any kind of branching concepts with waterfalls, so that's an important notion. So here we are, we're creating a new waterfall. It's asking us for dialog ID. So this dialog ID essentially can be anything as long as it's again unique within this context. So I'm just going to give it the name of nice questions. Nice questions waterfall. and pass in the waterfall steps. Okay, so the only squiggly things we've got left to do now is to sort these out. So we can generate our methods. And let's rearrange them so that in the same order. So we'll put the initialize first. Okay, so everything should be in the right order now. Put a breakpoint in here. Actually put breakpoints on all of them. But eventually we'll be deleting those and re-putting them in. Okay, so that's the core of implementation of the dialogue. So how are they launching it? So let's go to our sample, to the reference. So this is in the constructor of our main app. We can see that the logger is indeed passed in here as well, and something called the user state. Now these are important to us now because we are interested in state. So we're going to want all of these to be added to ours. So let's come back to there, go back to our bot. So what have we got in our constructor? At the moment we've only got the services. So let's pass in these. Again, a little squiggly line on that. Hopefully it will automatically fix that for us. It has. That's great. So back to the examples. So it's the services coming in, user state and conversation state are coming off these. So let's grab those and the greeting accessor and the dialog state accessor. So we need all of those. So let's take those. So again, I don't like squiggly lines, so I shall get rid of all of those, underscores even. Okay, so let's make it this user state on that. Right, now we don't want it to be called greeting state anymore. Ours is called nice question state. And it won't know about that because it's not in the right namespace. So we add that in. So create a property called that. That's fine. It's on the user state. And let's start creating some of these fields. So this is a read-only field. This is going to be a read-only field. This is going to be a read-only field. And guess what? This is a read. It's not going to work. Read-only field. Get there in the end. So we've got what we've done there is we are storing something called a user state. So as a bot, as you log into a bot and you start using the bot, as a particular user, then their user state is stored, the information about them is stored. If they were to log in on another session, then that information, it would remember it, assuming we've got a persistent store. So that would carry on working. Conversation state is about this particular conversation. So I have one conversation as this user and remember that conversation. If I then stop and log into another machine or have another session, then that'll be a brand new conversation. So the two different types of state there. The user state will always follow the user. The conversation state is only about this particular conversation. So the greeting state, you'll see, comes off the user state. So that, in this case, actually greeting, that's not a good name for us, is it? We want to rename that to be questions state. So the nice question state is going to follow the user around. The dialog state, so this is an interesting one. So this remembers what conversational dialogue that we're having. And given that it is a conversational dialogue, then that lives in the conversation state. So hence this one. But this is a special framework type state, this dialog state. So what will happen is any dialogue that we have in the conversation, the framework will look after the fact that it's happening. It will look after where we are in that conversation, and it will store that, and it will look to store that in something called the dialog state. So we do need this whenever we start to use any kind of dialogue conversation. So this is a framework thing, and this is our thing. So this is particular to our app. So that's those two. Anything else that we need to grab from the sample? Oh yes, there is. So this is another important thing here. This is something we were missing before, so I'll just grab this dialog set. Let's put that in here. So these are all the available dialogue conversations that we can have from this root bot here, from the bot. So if we want the bot to be able to respond without doing too much additional work, then what we do and what the samples do is they load this every time. Now there are ways to mitigate this, but for now and for most of the samples, this is the recommended approach. So we need to load up our dialogue. So how do we do that? So we simply steal this. So we create a new dialog state, passing in, if we look at dialog set, it wants a dialog state. So we've got this here. This is our dialog state accessor here. So we can just pass it in. That will create a dialog set. Again, remember, every time a message comes in, this will be invoked. So this happens for every new message. So regardless of the conversations, every new message in a conversation, this is started. We're going to create an example or an instance of our dialog. So nice questions. And now we fitted it in a similar way. So we're going to give it an ID. So I'm going to call it nice questions. It doesn't have to be, in fact, I'll just call it nice questions ID. Right? It doesn't have to be. It can be anything you want, just as long as you remember what it is. So there's nice questions ID. It wants the user profile accessor. So this is going to be the nice question state accessor. The logger factory is passed in here. We're going to just pass it directly on. So in theory, let's just build that now. That should be, but actually, it should build, but I think we're missing a bit. So that's successfully built. That's great. Now, these have been passed in. So as we know before, if we've got no references, it means it's likely to mean it's coming in from dependency injection. If it's coming in from dependency injection, it likely means it's going to be coming in from the startup. So let's have a look in here into startup. Okay, so here we are, services singleton, we're adding the user state, services singleton, we're adding the conversation state. And these have been passed in something called a data store, and that's data store here. So memory store. So when I was talking about user storage, about remembering in different sessions, different machines, that requires a persistent store. And if you follow all the comments in here, there's ways of implementing a persistent store. So store them in Azure Blob Storage, for example, or CosmoDB is another favorite place to put them. For us now, because we don't want to necessarily get into the Azure side of things too much, we're just going to use this one. So this is a temporary in-memory store, so it runs for the session that we're debugging in. So we'll use the same thing here. So let's come to our startup. So it's before the bot is instantiated. We'll create our memory store, and again, you won't know what this is. So we use our little trick, adds them back into here. Let's add our conversation states. And then back to our bot. So now these are going to be available. Just check that I've got the logger. I'm sure that we've got a logger. Is that coming in from somewhere? Here we are, here's a logger. Catches errors, logger factory. Create logger. I think I've got that. Let's have a little look. Can't see a logger. Doesn't look like we're doing logger, so we better add that as well. So let's come in here. Just double check up here. Configurations. Anything else? We've done the bot config. We've added a config. Done the services thing. Done the CosmoDB thing. So let's iLogger. Create logger for the basic bot. Looks like that's pretty much it. So logger factory. It's created there. It's used there. That's fair enough. So let's take that. Do the same thing. So we don't have a logger factory. So now that helicopter's gone away, we can have a look at that logger factory. So that's just created there, grab the same thing, except I won't have the underscores because I don't like underscores. So I can just put that here. So that should, in theory, be everything. It's never assigned to, and we'll have default value of logger factory is never assigned to. Is it not? You're correct. So in the configure, so this is using the injection directly from .NET Core. So that's how we get our logger factory. Green squiggle. Right, great. That looks a lot better now. Let's build that. Cool. So let's come into here. Let's put a breakpoint in here, see what's going on. Let's run this up. Bot emulator out. So services have been called. We've got some user state, nothing particularly interesting there. Got some conversation state, and we've got a logger factory. So that's all looking pretty good. Does all this still run? Yeah, that all looks good. Okay, so we can stop that now. So let's actually start using this dialog. So we're going to come into our bot, so into the on-turn context, expect to get in, going to do the recognizer, and then we're going to do some dialog checking. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we've got our dialog context. So we did have this in once before, and now we're going to put it back. So what's going on here? So what this is going to do is, given our turn, given the message that we're going to come in, the framework is going to look at the dialogues, our dialog set, and it's going to see, so let's give this a proper name, dialog context. It's going to see whether we have an existing dialog context based on the turn and based on the IDs that are in here. And then, as we look at the example, it's choosing to do some of this stuff anyway. But what I'm going to do is this piece of work here. In fact, I'm going to take all of this and cut it out. So let's just take all of that down to there. And put it in front of the response. Okay, so it's the dialog context. Okay, so if our intent is going to be the intents we had from our Lewis model, so they are going to be things like Navy, for the moment anyway, things like Navy, things like power. I think it was military, wasn't it? Military, I think it was. Oh, no, defense. Defense, power. Those ones for the moment. We can have none in there. The nones are other intent. Right. So let me explain what's going on here. So what we're doing is, as you know, as I just mentioned, the dialog context is a framework thing. It's going to look inside our turn context and it's going to map the current turn context to any existing or active dialog from our dialog sets. That's just going to be loaded in here. We're then going to go off, regardless of that, we're going to ask Lewis for a result. Now this is important because you can have intents that allow you to exit a dialog, an active dialog. So for example, a cancel, some sort of cancel intent, some sort of quit intent. So you might want to ignore what the current dialog is. So we don't necessarily want to start looking at the dialog until we understand the intent of the user a bit better. So regardless of what the intent is, we then come in here, and as it says, continue with the current dialog. Now, this isn't necessarily true. So if there is no dialog, then the continue with dialog isn't going to give us anything particularly interesting, but it won't crash. All that will happen is that the framework will say you don't have a current dialog to continue, so you won't have any kind of response to worry about. Now, if we do have a current dialog and we want to do something about it, or the dialog hasn't finished, then we can come in here and then we can start looking at the I'll rephrase that. So if there isn't any dialog, then we're going to come in and do all of this, that's fine. If there is a current dialogue running, then it will invoke that dialogue and pass our thread, if you like, onto our conversation thread, onto the nice questions conversational dialogue. So wherever we are in a nice conversational dialogue, we'll go back into that. If there isn't one running, then we're going to come into here and we're going to start something as if we've got no dialogue. So what we're effectively saying here is continue and invoke the current dialogue, or we're going to come out here and we need to deal with the case where there is no dialogue running. So if we've got a defense or power intent, then what we're going to do is, for the moment, we're going to launch the nice questions dialogue. So that's kind of assuming that the question is nice. So we haven't looked at the sentiment, so yeah, I think you can probably guess the idea here. So we're going to go off and do the nice questions. Otherwise, we'll just send, I don't understand what you said to me, which is fine. These other cases are about what's happening if there is an active dialogue. So if there is or was an active dialogue, so if we're just waiting, then this thing is just going to flip through and kind of not do anything. If we are just waiting for a prompt for the user to respond to something inside of this dialogue. If the dialogue was finished, and i.e. the user has completed the dialogue in some fashion, or we've run out of steps to run in that dialogue, then we're going to get complete, and then we're going to call an end dialogue. So got another helicopter. I'll wait for that to move.